Welcome back to this new episode. This time we are going to talk about Ukraine. I have mentioned before that Ukraine should be our number one issue in foreign policy. And why is that? Not so much because of what Putin could do in Europe, but because of the way he could imprint a privateer standard in our relations with China if we let him to become a senior partner of Xi Jinping. And to understand this, we have to see what are China's plans for the future. And China's plans for the future are not interlinked with the West or the United States as much as with the global South. They want to expand in that market and access to those resources in their own terms. And to see how this could be very harmful, we should remember the way after Trump withdrew from the Sahel, that is this part of Africa where Muslim fundamentalist groups linked to Al Qaeda had been causing trouble. Russia filled the void with the Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group, above all, has been trying to secure access to resources. Resources Russia is not going to process because Russia's economy is basically a raw material exporter. Oil, grain, fertilizers is for China. So, in other words, Putin wants to be China's enforcer in this extended market where China wants to expand the global South. And if we let him win in Ukraine, he's going to be elevated to a senior partner and will have a weight in our relations with China in those markets. When when we need access to resources in, for instance, rare materials for electric vehicles, and we are denied the access to those resources in Africa because those resources are no longer ruled by market rules, but by geopolitical considerations. So we have to be very careful about that. Besides the fact that if Putin wins, it will make evident that the United States and NATO are paper tigers nobody should trust, and especially after the way other countries are seeing how Biden and NATO have duped Zelensky. So that means that if China, as Paul Krugman in one of his articles have suggested, decides to compensate for their poor economy with geopolitical gains in the South China Sea or Taiwan, they will be more likely to take that step if they see that Putin can win in Ukraine. Not much because they have an overwhelming force, but because we have deceived Zelensky over and over and neglected to do what a reliable counterpart should do. Now, let me get back just for a second about the instability at nuclear. Uh, Russia has been making threats of the nuclear order, and though it's very unlikely that they could use strategic nuclear weapons, I would not discard that they could use tactical nuclear weapons, which are which whose destructive range is much more limited. Now, with respect to the effects Putin could have in the food and fertilizers market, we just have to remember what he did in 2022 when he attacked Odessa and grain facilities. And if you are worried about the climate, remember that Putin ambitions in the Arctic are not precisely compatible with a green agenda. All these considerations are should be on our side, yeah. But Biden's poor foreign policy has caused the opposite effect, because China doesn't want to inherit a nuclear wasteland. So they have made over and over, given warnings to Putin about nuclear that we have not been able to take advantage of. Then Ukraine, China was very satisfied with Ukraine being a supplier of grains, because Ukraine didn't have any aspirations of being of weighing in China's political decisions. Now, with Putin practically destroying the supplying chain in grains, now they have replaced in the Chinese market the grain that otherwise would have come from Ukraine. Besides, with respect to climate, also China is not interested in inheriting a wasteland, and but putting that consideration is secondary with respect to use the Arctic for trade and military goals. So now let's go to Europe. Europe is in Europe. I don't expect, unless we are talking about countries like Georgia, military incursions by Putin. What he's going to do, and what RUSA has detailed in a report he plans to do, are destabilization tactics, trying to bring down governments. And even though we have serious reporting have linked many acts of sabotage in Germany and other countries to Putin, their goal in Europe is basically limited to countries that were once part of the Soviet sphere. With respect to Ukraine, then, what will happen if Putin wins? Well, if Putin wins, Zelensky is not going to last long, because it's going to be very easy for once the pain once the morning begins and the people realize that they have wasted so much resources and lives to end up conceding one quarter or 1/5 of their territory anyway, they are not going to like Zelensky very much, either because he was too naive to trust the United States, or because some will say he was not practical enough to make concessions to Putin. What means that he will be eventually replaced by another Yanukovych. You must remember Yanukovych was like the puppet Putin has in Belarus, but Yanukovych was the ruler of a kleptocracy that stole non-stop from Ukraine until he was deposed by the Ukrainian people. And that's the turning point from which Putin starts a hard line against this country. But if people realize they have been duped, and when the dust settles and they see all the pain and they have had for nothing, and much worse that it was preventable, they might end up siding with another Putin puppet. And if they resist, there is always the Chechnya solution. The second Chechen war was is a very good example of how Putin conceives counterinsurgency. Pretty much destroy the country, turn it into a failed state, and install a puppet like Karimov. Now, let's give a minute to consider why Putin has adopted that hardline position. After 2014, when he got away with the take of the Donbass and Crimea with a slap on the wrist, Putin and his oligarchs were not afraid of the West. They still kept siphoning their ill-conceived riches to the West. But as Zelensky in 2022 decided to resist, and the West had no other alternative but to back Zelensky, Putin and his oligarchs can no longer siphon those ill-conceived wealth to the West, so they have to turn to the East. And their only alternative is to live in a yuan-controlled zone, because otherwise he's going to be reached by the West sanctions, especially SWIFT, that controls the flow of money, some payments, remittances. So they need a yuan zone in which they could live untouched by the West sanctions and could continue doing what we let him do in the West, just this time in the East. Now, as if I have been able to convince you that Putin that Ukraine should be our number one priority in foreign policy. Let's let's talk a little bit about strategy and the way the war has been waged. The evolution has been pretty discouraging because unfortunately the Biden administration engaged in an absurd campaign of rationing. So the attitude at first was, tell me what you need to beat the Russians and we'll give it to you. Immediately, almost immediately, that turned into, no, we are going to give it to you when you need it. And they, for instance, the MIG systems to counter the Russian mines were just 15% of what Ukraine requested. Just to give you an example of what we are going to go into a bit more of detail in a little bit. That's why the Russians could build the Surovikin line, that these fortifications built in the center and south, especially, that made practically impossible for the counterinsurgency make progress, especially because they lacked of the proper backing on supplies. Then this rationing forced Ukraine into a war of attrition, and that is perfect. That is particularly disturbing because we know that a country that is whose army is much smaller is going to have a very hard time winning a war of attrition against Russia. And yet, that's how the Biden administration forced Zelensky to wage war. Curiously, at the same time, General Milley decried that the Ukrainians didn't know how to use combined arms. But combined arms requires from Blitzkrieg and the D-Day to shock and awe in 2003 in Iraq, require one, that you have control of the air coverage, and second, that you have an overwhelming force. That way, you once you start your attack, your enemy is not going to be able to maneuver fast enough to stop you. But Ukraine never had those materials. So never had that air supply, air coverage. So it was absurd, and it was particularly annoying that nobody in the press could call out General Milley for saying something so stupid about the Ukrainians not being able to use combined arms when they didn't have overwhelming force or air coverage, air superiority. Then if Ukraine has been able to resist this long has been because of the heroic morale of their soldiers that has surprised us all. And we have seen that in Bakhmut. And we saw that in Abdika, excuse me. And that's why it was particularly irritating that Biden used with excuse the lack of collaboration of Republicans to let Putin take a Dika and use it as a trophy in the elections of March 15 to 17 in Russia to win the elections using, as I said, Abdika as a trophy, thanks to Joe Biden and his crew of happy pillow fighters, by Blinken and Sullivan. Now we see the same rationing that is putting at risk Pokrovsk and Chasibar. Pokrovsk first, that is about to fall into Russian hands, and Pokrovsk is especially important because it's a communication hub. That means it's an point of that connects many routes of communications in the front. So it should not surprise us that that Zelensky gave he hit much of his plans to take Kursk inside Russia from the Biden administration, because the Biden administration was sabotaging them any way they could. And this incursion in Kursk in Russia has been particularly useful to weaken Putin inside Moscow, because it makes him look weak. It brings the war to the Russians. And still, after more than 2 years into the war, the Ukrainians are outgunned and outmanned by the Russians. And having said that, let me leave you with the second part of my interview to President Biden after we could reconnect with the White House. Welcome to the second part of our interview with President Biden. After establishing the connection with the White House, we have again the privilege of having the president as our guest, and I want to ask him some questions about the upcoming elections. Mr. President, Kamala Harris is struggling in the swing state polls, as your former campaign manager, Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, has insisted on presenting her as a continuation of your administration. The problem is that your administration is very unpopular. How can she sell herself as the candidate of change if she also is advised to present herself as a continuation of your tenure? No, I am very popular. You are very popular? Yes, Jen said so. She said, everybody loves you, Joe. You should have kept running as I told you. So I told her, don't worry, Jen. I beat Medicare. Did you beat Medicare? Yes. Didn't you watch the debate? But according to Real Clear Politics, she's holding only 2 out of 7 swing states and within the margin of error. No, Mr. President, the most salient issue in the voters' minds is the uncertainty on inflation and interest rates. The New York Fed shows very clearly the effect that is causing on voters with incomes around $50,000. You have a very respected Secretary of the Treasury. Why your administration is doing nothing to tackle this issue? Jen and Jake decide about the economy now, and they say voters are happy. Jennifer O'Malley Dillon and Jake Sullivan. Yes, yes, they are very smart. She told me I was going to win in a landslide in the next elections, and that body Pelosi put all Fox against me. So Jen decided that I would drop out, but only if she, Kamala, get her as her campaign manager. What? And Jake Sullivan is very smart because he's cool. But, but, Normally, Dillon is terrible. She only wants to legitimize her people in your administration, even if that means Democrats lose to Trump. And after the way you have caved to Netanyahu every single time, and after what you did to Zelensky, Sullivan has made the United States a laughingstock nobody trusts. No, that's not true. I Jake beat China and Russia, and I beat Medicare. Watch the debate. You know that if Trump is elected, he's going to destroy the good parts of your legacy in a year, don't you? No, no. I beat Trump too. And all the baddies in Iran. Look, here he is. Jake, come here. Tell this guy we beat all the baddies and that. I told you not to talk on the phone. Closet. No, the closet, no. Jake. Closet, I said. I am cool. Ah! Mr. President, somebody contact the White House. It seems Jake Sullivan has assaulted the president. Well, while we try to learn what happened to the president, we leave you with the second part of the main show. Well, welcome back. Let's retake our assessment of Ukraine. We have talked a little bit about terrible rationing. The terrible rationing is implemented by the Biden administration. Their lack of strategy, as noted by General Ben Hodges. And now let's go to another part of this same pitiful picture that is the case of sanctions and the case of the Russian reserves. Sanctions were implemented, but were pretty much based on affidavits and in very tiny, limited installments. Because if you are an average man, you may wonder if we have put hard sanctions that are going to make Putin cry or whatever they said at the moment, why you needed a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth. The last time I counted, it was 13 rounds of sanctions. But why do you need, if your sanctions were serious in the first place, if your first round, why did you need it even a second round? Well, because they were basically the same slaps on the wrist that like the ones implemented with Jake Sullivan in 2014. The problem is that they were not enforced and they were based on affidavits. So it was easy for Russia to triangulate, for instance, selling oil to Turkey, so they can be blended with other it could be mixed with other blends and then resold to the international market. or when things that were items that were banned by the sanctions could were imported massively by Kazakhstan, countries like Kazakhstan, and then re-exported to Russia. So, or you have the case of the Iranian of the shadow fleet that, with the help of Iran, helped circumvent much of the sanctions. And because of the discredit won by the United States and NATO, the way that India and China is the number one buyer, purchaser of Russian oil, kept buying Russian oil at discounted prices. And that's the story of why the sanctions were of very limited effect, were very easy to circumvent, and became a monument of the West's weakness. Then, in the case of the Russian reserves, this is particularly tragic because since September of 2023, we have an assessment by Lawrence Tribe about the legal grounds on which these Russian reserves could be seized and used to fund a proper counter offensive for Russia that could have taken place next year. Instead of that, fears on Europe and then fears on the Biden administration kept postponing and postponing a final decision. In the end, you didn't have even accurate information. At one point, it was said that 60 of about 300 billion, 60 were in the United States. Then another account say it was just 5, and the White House never bothered to clarify anything. The point is that more than 2 years into the war, there is the issue of Putin's reserves have been watered down to a loan with the reserves of collateral, which is a very watered down version that is going to be just enough to let Ukraine survive, but not enough to let them win. Then another issue is procurement, especially at artillery. In 2023, the NATO pledged 1 million shells to Ukraine. It only delivered 300,000. This year, they have made a similar pledge, another 1 million, and it's expected to deliver just half, or a bit more than, little more than half. And it's not just enough, it's not just about capacity, it's also about standardization. There are 15 to 17 different kinds of 155 millimeters shells produced, and no standardization. So this is a joke. And yet, more than 2 years into the war, it has not received a proper solution. Then, at least since it's January 2023, Jack Watling, that is the expert I follow the most about the military issues in Ukraine. Jack Watling highlighted the need to improve training at the company and brigade level, especially at the brigade level. Yet, that issue has remained unsolved, which is particularly tragic because as morale has been crumbling in Ukraine, troops, a reasonable supply of troops have become a bottleneck, and is additionally tragic to see that while Russia is offering visas to Indians, is even deceiving them into getting into Russia so they could send them to war, and has gotten Kim Jong-un to send him North Koreans to fight in the war because that Putin doesn't want to upset the Russian population in the cities with a harsh conscription. And we have not been able to offer visas to foreign veterans, especially when last year immigration was discussed in Europe, and this issue have been added of providing visas to foreign veterans of other countries willing to fight in Ukraine, but we have not done even that. And training, well, I have already mentioned that is still to be seen. So really, there is no hope of getting enough seasoned soldiers for a counteroffensive in next year. So we are just our options are shameful defeat or just a more decent defeat, but not victory. And that's tragic because this war could have been won. What would have meant downgrading Putin to the status of junior partner in the Chinese sphere. Then we, as Putin has made threats of escalation and nuclear threats, Biden has practically let Putin dictate the terms of engagement. What if we could send? Putin has decided for a long time whether we could train Ukrainians to fly F-16s, about whether the Ukrainians could hit targets inside Russia, about so and so on. So practically Putin has been, we have been requesting Putin's permission to aid Ukraine, and this has all resulted in a war of attrition, in slow decisions that obviously hurt the most the smaller country, in this case Ukraine. Then another issue is propaganda. Putin is having big problems with the economy that are creating a lot of anxieties. There have been some even protests by wives and loved ones of soldiers who have been terrible mistreated by Putin, sending them to cannon fodder against the Ukrainian lines with little or no training. So have we used this as propaganda to try to change attitudes toward Putin inside Russia? No. Then another point is electronic war and jamming. Since the very beginning, we saw Russia was getting the edge on electronic war. They were jamming the HIMARS, that are these long-range missiles. We use to that with which we supply the Ukrainians. And have we recovered the edge? No. The Russians still have the edge on jamming and electronic war. Then another tragic point is the ATACMS. The ATACMS were supposed to give Ukrainians a strategic edge, because you don't win a war by bringing down a bridge or hitting a base in isolation. It has to be, as they themselves claim, part of a combined arms plan, a strategy. So if for instance, the Kerch bridge that is connecting Crimea with Russia is brought down just before a massive counteroffensive is launched, then it's going to have a strategic goal, because the enemy is not going to have time enough to adapt and resupply their troops, and they are going to suffer huge losses. But that's another point, because the ATACMS were supposed to give a strategic edge to the Ukrainians, and with much fanfare, the Biden administration announced they were sending the ATACMS. But what they sent were the M39 version, that is the oldest version of the ATACMS, that have a much limited range, and they don't have a warhead that is powerful enough, because it's just a cluster bomb warhead. So this is the way, this is the incredible way in which the Biden administration has been trying to dupe the Ukrainians and us about their progress in this issue. Now, let me mention, when with respect to the letting Putin dictate the terms of engagement, that it's true that nobody wants a nuclear war. But let's remember that Putin doesn't have anywhere else to run if China close its doors to him. So we have good reasons to believe that it's more blood than anything. Remember that Putin thinks like a gangster, not like a psychopath, sociopath like Hitler. Yet, instead of following the example of Kennedy in 1962 during the missiles crisis, we have followed the example of Neville Chamberlain in 1938, appeasement. All this, of course, and we can add to that the case of targets in Russia. The Biden administration, after declaring that Zelensky could hit Russia wherever they wanted, when they finally seemed to give up on this issue, it happened that they were corrected by the Institute for the Study of War that the ATACMS were not included in that authorization, And that authorization was limited to just 100 kilometers from the front. So it was another pathetic lie. We should, to help Ukraine supply their army with their own weapons, at this time, we should be talking about a no-fly zone in Western Ukraine, but that is not even under consideration. So it's not, we should not be surprised to see the way the morale has suffered in Ukraine and how people are trying to avoid the draft because, of course, they don't want to go to a meat grinder because Zelensky doesn't have more troops to replace them. And if you don't see on that the seed of a possible Yanukovych coming after Ukraine finally collapses, then you are not seeing you are not seeing right the picture. It would be very sad if they, after all that aid that we have procrastinated and wasted, all that ends up in another Yanukovych that is going to be another vassal for Putin. But that's the way the Biden administration has been mishandling this issue. So we have another, that brings us to if winning militarily is going to be much worse, how about peace? Well, you cannot, number one, you cannot trust Putin. In 1991, in 1994, Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons in exchange for independence. And Putin just violated those accords, those agreements. Then after 2014, the Minsk Accords were also were made irrelevant by the violations made by Putin. And even you could say the same about the Budapest Memo. So if you cannot trust Putin and you are going to get a peace by Putin, what stops him from taking the rest of Ukraine in case he cannot, in case Zelensky can survive? You can't. So you are offering Ukraine nothing. They will see their country destroyed in exchange of Putin having time to rebuild his army. And he will, because now he will be a senior partner for Xi. So that means that we have to get China involved. That's exactly what the Biden administration doesn't want because of Jake Sullivan's stupid ideas. But you need to get China because China have some reasons to want stability. They don't want to inherit a wasteland. They don't want to inherit a state of perpetual war. And that was the idea pushed by Macron. So we have to revive that idea. Of course, to get China involved, and we are going to talk a bit more in another video about China, we have to give China something. China have very harsh problems because of their property sector, their overcapacity in exports that is going to go nowhere. It's going, so it's a problem we cannot ignore, and because of their demographics. So we could get to an understanding with China the way in the 80s and 90s we got an understanding with the Japanese. So it's possible. Our work with China should be to bring our relations with that country to that standard. In that case, a standard in which there is no room for Putin and his privateer standard. And that would mean isolating Putin or at least reducing him to a junior partner. And yet that's not what we are doing. And why we are not doing that after so many screw ups? Because Jake Sullivan, in his vision, he cannot connect Russia with China, and he proposes that Russia had to be contained, but it's China to which we should isolate. And that's why, for instance, we have been done ridiculous things like selling weapons to Taiwan and Philippines when we know well that there is no war game scenario where or Taiwan or the Philippines could contain China without us involved. And that our goal should be not to push Xi toward Putin, but isolate Putin and to find an accommodation with China. I'm not saying that we can avoid a war with China in the future, but we have good reasons to. There are there are factors that allows us, if we are wise, to avoid a war, find a reasonable accommodation, and isolate the Putin's militaristic ambition. Then another thing is we have to stop this nonsense about rationing and appeasement. Roosevelt, the Lend-Lease started in 1941, but Roosevelt already in 1940 was sending England weapons they needed for their self-defense. And we today even have the Excess Defense Act that allows Biden to decommission war material that then could be sent to Zelensky. And this was true all the time. He was letting the Republicans hold the Ukraine aid and saying that it was Republicans who were to blame. No, yeah, they were to blame. But Biden too, because he could have used the Excess Defense Act, and he didn't. So he could have explained, instead of this ridiculous narrative about the good guy who gives a hand to the small guy and nonsense like that, he could have explained the American people what happens to us if Putin wins. Now, most Republicans have not been very collaborative, and it's true, but then use their bluffs. Trump bluffed about helping Ukraine with a loan instead of aid. Okay, call the bluff. sometime in the future we can condone that debt. Johnson, the speaker Johnson, bluffed about using Ukraine reserves to help Putin's reserves to help Ukraine. So call his bluff, get the vote to make feasible seizing those reserves and giving them to Zelensky. But none of that was done because Biden's dithering and hesitation always took first place. Now, another factor that we should use is China's ambitions. China wants nuclear stability, which is more precarious if Putin wins. China doesn't want Putin and Kim Jong-un to elevate or much less to coordinate between themselves because he wants them as vassals. So China has Putin is their ally, but they would prefer much more a more obedient ally. Humbling Putin in Ukraine would help a lot. And then the factors in their economy I have mentioned before, on which China needs the West more than he needs Putin. So we have cards to play, chips with whom we can negotiate, and we are not doing that. And why? Because of Jake Sullivan's stupid ideas. So a war plan created by pillow fighters, if you want. Then finally, damage could be, remember that the damage might be at this point irreversible, but the alternative is worse. So what could we do? We should get serious about arming Ukraine to show China we mean it, that we are resolved. Instead of that, we have Biden continuing with his disastrous rationing. And I say that because the alternative is Trump's crooked isolationism. So we need to make this work, and we are not doing it seriously. So, and the other point is get China involved. So because as Ukraine is more and more battered because of more than 2 years of war and less likely to get a military victory, the more we need a diplomatic solution. And the diplomatic solution is not going to come from convincing China of anything. China is going to put their interest before. We have to make a deal on trade, on climate, on debt, on international debt with them, so they have a good reason to stop Putin, because China is the #1 buyer of oil, of Putin's oil. Is their more important trading partner. If China wants to stop the war tomorrow, it can, but it will not if we just give him speeches. That's stupid. We have to give them reasons. We have to follow the example of FDR. Thank you.